August 23, 1941. Wolfschanze, East Prussia. General Heinz Guderian's boots echo across the wooden floor of Adolf Hitler's field headquarters as he prepares to make the most important argument of his military career. This is madness. We are 220 miles from Moscow. 220 miles! My panzers could be at the gates of the Kremlin in 3 weeks, and he wants to send us south. Guderian had flown here from the front with General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff. 3 days earlier, on August 18, the Oberkommando des Heeres, the German Army High Command, had submitted a strategic document to Hitler that methodically, logically, argued for the continuation of Operation Barbarossa's primary objective, the capture of Moscow. The document stated that Army Groups North and South possessed sufficient strength to accomplish their objectives without assistance. It emphasized that autumn weather would arrive in October, winter in November. There was time for precisely one decisive operation before the Russian winter, the same winter that had annihilated Napoleon's Grande Armée 129 years earlier, made further offensive operations impossible. Hitler had rejected the proposal on August 20. His written response prioritized economic objectives, depriving the Soviet Union of Ukraine's coal, iron ore, and industrial capacity. Now Guderian stands before the Führer, authorized by Halder to make one final appeal. The meeting lasts 2 hours. Guderian presents every operational argument: the proximity to Moscow, the weakness of Soviet defenses before the capital, the strategic value of destroying the Soviet command structure, the advancing calendar. Hitler listens patiently, occasionally nodding. Then he delivers his verdict. "My generals know nothing about the economic aspects of war," Hitler declares. "Moscow can wait. The industrial resources of Ukraine cannot. Panzer Group 2 will turn south toward Kiev." The order is final. As Guderian flies back to his headquarters, he knows with absolute certainty that Germany has just lost its best chance to knock the Soviet Union out of the war in 1941. The journey to this catastrophic decision had begun 10 weeks earlier. June 22, 1941, 3:15 hours. Along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, 3 million German soldiers, 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. 3 army groups advanced simultaneously: Army Group North toward Leningrad, Army Group South toward Kiev and Ukraine, and Army Group Center, the strongest formation, driving directly toward Moscow along the traditional invasion route through Minsk and Smolensk. Army Group Center consisted of 2 panzer groups: Panzer Group 2 under Guderian and Panzer Group 3 under Hermann Hoth, supported by the 4th and 9th Armies. Together, they fielded approximately 1,700 tanks organized in 9 panzer divisions. Their objective was simple: advance 600 miles to Moscow, encircling and destroying Soviet forces along the way, and capture the Soviet capital before winter. The initial advance exceeded all expectations. Guderian's Panzer Group 2 reached Minsk by June 29, encircling 300,000 Soviet troops. By July 16, German forces had captured Smolensk, just 220 miles from Moscow. Soviet resistance, though often fierce, appeared disorganized. Stalin's purges of the Red Army Officer Corps in 1937–1938 had decapitated Soviet military leadership. Units fought with desperate courage, but lacked coordinated strategy. But the advance had not been without cost. German panzer divisions, designed for rapid breakthrough operations in Western Europe, were grinding themselves down on the vast distances and poor roads of Russia. Each tank required constant maintenance. Dust infiltrated engines designed for European conditions. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of primitive roads. By August, Guderian's panzer divisions had suffered approximately 30% equipment losses due to combat and mechanical breakdown combined. Yet Moscow seemed within grasp. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, pressed Hitler repeatedly for permission to resume the Moscow offensive. Soviet forces before the capital were hurt, disorganized, retreating. A concentrated thrust by both panzer groups, Bock argued, could reach Moscow before the autumn rains turned Russian roads to impassable mud. Hitler, however, looked south. In Ukraine, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group South had advanced slower than Army Group Center. Kiev, Ukraine's capital and the Soviet Union's third-largest city, remained in Soviet hands, defended by the Soviet Southwestern Front under Marshal Semyon Budonny. More critically, Kiev anchored a Soviet salient that projected westward into the German advance. As long as Soviet forces held Kiev, they threatened the southern flank of any German drive toward Moscow. On July 19th, Hitler issued Führer Directive 33, ordering Army Group Center to halt its advance and detach forces to assist Army Groups North and South. The directive fundamentally shifted German strategy from operational objectives, destroying the Red Army and capturing Moscow, to economic objectives, seizing Leningrad, Ukraine's agricultural and industrial resources, and the Caucasus oil fields. The German High Command reacted with barely concealed horror. General Halder wrote in his war diary, "The Führer's constant interference is becoming intolerable." Field Marshal von Bock protested directly to Hitler on July 27, arguing that dispersing Army Group Center's strength would squander Germany's best opportunity for decisive victory. Army Group Center's panzers, Bock emphasized, were positioned to deliver a knockout blow against Moscow before winter. Hitler remained unmoved. On August 12, he visited Army Group Center headquarters personally and reiterated his strategic vision. Germany must secure Ukraine's economic resources before winter. Economic strength, Hitler argued, would enable Germany to outlast the Soviet Union in a prolonged war. Taking Moscow, merely a geographical expression, in Hitler's words, would accomplish. Hitler's August 20 rejection of the Army High Command's proposal revealed a fundamental philosophical divide that would define the entire Eastern Front campaign. German military doctrine, developed through decades of Prussian military tradition and refined in World War I, emphasized Bewegungskrieg, maneuver warfare focused on destroying enemy forces in the field. Control of territory mattered only insofar as it enabled the destruction of enemy armies. This operational philosophy had guided German strategy since the wars of German unification in the 1860s. Destroy the enemy's army, doctrine taught, and territorial objectives would follow automatically. Hitler's strategic vision prioritized economic control. Germany's experience in World War I, when the British naval blockade had starved German industry of raw materials, had profoundly influenced Hitler's thinking. In Mein Kampf and numerous speeches, Hitler emphasized Lebensraum, living space, and access to resources as prerequisites for German survival. Ukraine represented the Soviet Union's breadbasket, its coal and iron reserves, its industrial capacity. Capturing these resources, Hitler believed, would cripple Soviet war-making capacity regardless of whether German forces took Moscow. The disconnect was complete. Hitler and his generals were prosecuting different wars using the same army. Throughout August, the argument intensified. On August 21, Hitler issued Führer Directive 34, formally ordering Panzer Group 2 to turn south and assist Army Group South in capturing Kiev. Guderian received the order at his headquarters and immediately protested to Field Marshal von Bock. Bock supported Guderian and arranged the August 23 meeting with Hitler, sending Halder and Guderian to East Prussia with authorization to make every possible argument for continuing toward Moscow. The August 23 meeting followed a familiar pattern. Hitler allowed Guderian to present his complete operational case. Moscow was 220 miles distant. Soviet defenses were crumbling. The panzer groups could reach the city within 3 weeks if they maintained momentum. Once Moscow fell, the Soviet Union's command and control structure, transportation hub, and arms production center would be in German hands. The psychological impact would be devastating. Without Moscow's rail nexus, Soviet forces would struggle to coordinate operations across the vast front. Hitler listened without interruption. Then he systematically dismantled each argument. Moscow was merely a name on a map, Hitler said. Taking cities meant nothing. What mattered was destroying the Soviet Union's capacity to wage war. Ukraine's resources were that capacity. As for Soviet command and control, Stalin would simply move his headquarters elsewhere, to Kuibyshev on the Volga, perhaps, or beyond the Urals. But Ukraine's coal and steel mills could not be moved. The operation that followed demonstrated both the brilliance and the futility of Hitler's decision. Panzer Group 2 consisted of 5 panzer divisions, 3 motorized divisions, and attached infantry formations, approximately 700 operational tanks supported by 500 armored vehicles. These forces disengaged from their positions before Moscow and began moving south on August 25, driving toward Konotop and Romny in northern Ukraine. Their objective? Link up with Panzer Group 1 advancing northward from Army Group South and encircle Soviet forces defending Kiev. The Soviet command structure failed completely to recognize the danger. Stalin, convinced that Moscow remained Germany's primary objective, interpreted Guderian's southward movement as a feint, a maneuver to threaten Army Group Center's flank before the main assault on Moscow resumed. Stalin ordered Marshal Budyonny to hold Kiev at all costs. Budyonny's southwestern front consisted of 5 Soviet armies totaling approximately 850,000 men, deployed in an arc west and south of Kiev. Those armies were marching into the largest encirclement in military history. On September 12, lead elements of Panzer Group 2 reached Romny, 150 miles east of Kiev. On September 14, Panzer Group 1's forward units reached Lochvitsa, 25 miles south of Romny. On September 15, at 1800 hours, advanced reconnaissance elements from both panzer groups made contact near the village of Lochvitsa. The encirclement was complete. 5 Soviet armies, the 5th, 21st, 26th, 37th, and 38th, were trapped in a pocket approximately 130 miles in diameter west of Kiev. Soviet commanders finally recognized the catastrophe. Marshal Budyonny requested permission to abandon Kiev and retreat eastward. Stalin initially refused. Only on September 17, with German panzers already behind his forces, did Stalin authorize withdrawal, far too late. Soviet units attempting to break out encountered German armor and infantry formations blocking every escape route. The Battle of Kiev officially ended on September 26, 1941. German forces counted 665,000 Soviet prisoners, though post-war Soviet sources suggest approximately 616,000 captured, with an additional 84,000 killed. 4 Soviet armies had been effectively annihilated. Total Soviet losses exceeded 700,000. Additionally, German forces captured or destroyed 884 tanks, 3,718 artillery pieces, and thousands of trucks and support vehicles. Hitler pronounced it the greatest battle in history. From a tactical standpoint, he was correct. No military force in history had ever encircled and captured more enemy soldiers in a single operation. But tactics are not strategy. While German forces were destroying Soviet armies at Kiev, other Soviet armies were digging in before Moscow. Lieutenant Hans-Jürgen Schroeder, serving with the 7th Panzer Division of Panzer Group II, recorded his thoughts in a letter dated September 28, 2 days after Kiev fell. "We have won a great victory. The Russians lost more than 500,000 men. But I cannot help thinking of Moscow. We were so close. Just 3 weeks' march away. And now it is October. The weather is changing. Yesterday it rained all day. The roads are becoming difficult. How much time have we lost?" The answer was 44 days. From August 21, when Hitler issued Directive 34 ordering Panzer Group II South, to October 2, when Operation Typhoon, the renewed assault on Moscow, finally began, precisely 44 days elapsed. In that time, the Soviet Union mobilized 800,000 additional troops, established 3 new defensive belts before Moscow, relocated critical war industries beyond the Urals, and prepared for the defense that would determine the war's outcome. German intelligence officers examining Soviet defensive preparations in late September made a disturbing discovery. Soviet forces had constructed elaborate trench systems, anti-tank ditches, concrete bunkers, and field fortifications in 3 successive defensive lines west of Moscow. These fortifications had not existed in August. Every day spent fighting at Kiev had been a day Soviet engineers spent preparing Moscow's defenses. Major Heinz-Georg Lemm, intelligence officer for Army Group Center, submitted a report on September 29, noting, "Enemy defensive works before Moscow have been substantially strengthened during the past month. Fortifications include continuous trench lines, prepared artillery positions, anti-tank barriers, and civilian labor battalions constructing additional positions. Estimate: enemy has utilized 30 to 40 days to improve defensive situation." The window was closing. Operation Typhoon would launch with forces that had just completed the most exhausting encirclement operation in military history. The panzers needed maintenance. The infantry needed rest. Supply depots needed replenishment. But the calendar permitted no delays. Autumn was arriving. Winter followed autumn. On October 2, 1941, Operation Typhoon began. 2 million German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, 14,000 artillery pieces, and 1,390 aircraft. The fundamental strategic disagreement between Hitler and his generals represented 2 irreconcilable philosophies of warfare. German military doctrine, as taught at the Kriegsakademie and refined through Prussia's wars of the 19th century, rested on a foundation established by Karl von Clausewitz. War is the continuation of politics by other means, and its purpose is to destroy the enemy's capacity and will to resist. The primary method of achieving this was Vernichtungsschlacht, the battle of annihilation, in which concentrated force destroyed enemy armies in decisive engagements. Territory was merely the chessboard on which these decisive battles occurred. This doctrine had guided German strategy in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71, when Prussian armies encircled and destroyed French forces at Sedan and Metz, leading to France's collapse despite Paris remaining uncaptured until the war's end. It had guided German planning in World War I, particularly the Schlieffen Plan's emphasis on destroying French armies through a massive wheeling movement through Belgium. Even in defeat, German commanders remained convinced that operational superiority, the ability to outmaneuver and destroy enemy forces, represented the path to victory. Hitler's strategic philosophy emerged from different experiences. His service as a frontline soldier in World War I had shown him how Germany's industrial economy collapsed under the strain of British naval blockade. By 1918, German civilians were starving. German factories lacked raw materials. Germany's armies, though still capable of tactical victories, could not be sustained by an exhausted economy. Hitler had watched the Weimar Republic struggle with economic instability throughout the 1920s. He had articulated in Mein Kampf his belief that Germany required Lebensraum, territory that would provide agricultural produce, raw materials, and economic self-sufficiency. The invasion of the Soviet Union represented Hitler's attempt to secure that economic foundation. Ukraine's Black Earth produced grain that could feed German civilians and soldiers. Ukraine's Donets Basin contained coal and iron ore that could fuel German industry. The Caucasus oil fields beyond Ukraine could provide the petroleum that powered Germany's mechanized military. Control of these resources would enable Germany to wage a prolonged war against Britain and potentially the United States. Moscow was merely a city. Resources were power. The mathematics of Hitler's strategy appeared compelling. Soviet industrial production in 1940 included 18.3 million tons of steel, much of it produced in Ukrainian mills. Soviet grain production totaled approximately 95 million tons, with Ukraine contributing roughly 25%. Germany's own steel production in 1940 reached only 19.3 million tons. If Germany could capture Soviet industrial capacity intact, the combined German-Soviet economy would dwarf British production and could challenge even American industrial might. But Hitler's strategic mathematics omitted a critical variable. General Halder understood this. His war diary entry from August 18th, the day the Army High Command submitted its strategic document arguing for Moscow, included a precise calculation. Approximately 45 days of suitable weather remain before autumn rains render major operations impractical. Moscow operation requires minimum 30 days, including preparation and advance. Kiev operation requires minimum 25 days. Both operations cannot be completed before weather deteriorates. Field Marshal von Bock understood this. His repeated protests to Hitler throughout August emphasized the same theme. Momentum, once lost, could not be recovered. Soviet forces were retreating, disorganized, vulnerable. Give them time and they would recover. Strike now and Moscow would fall. Delay and the opportunity would pass. Guderian understood this better than anyone. His entire career as a panzer commander rested on the principle of continuous pressure. His doctrine, articulated in Achtung Panzer, published in 1937, emphasized that armored forces achieve decisive results through relentless advance, never allowing defeated enemies time to reconstitute defenses. Each day of delay multiplied the enemy's defensive capability geometrically. Hitler rejected these arguments because he calculated on a different timescale. His generals thought in terms of campaigns measured in weeks. Hitler thought in terms of wars measured in years. Yes, taking Moscow quickly, Operation Typhoon began on October 2, 1941, with the largest concentration of German military power ever assembled for a single operation. Army Group Center's renewed offensive toward Moscow employed 78 divisions, including 14 panzer divisions and 8 motorized divisions, approximately 2 million men, 1,000 tanks, 14,000 artillery pieces, and 1,390 aircraft. 3 panzer groups would execute a massive double envelopment. Panzer Group 3 from the north, Panzer Group 4 from the center, and Panzer Group 2, now redesignated 2nd Panzer Army, from the south. Initial results matched German expectations. On October 7, German forces completed a massive encirclement at Vyazma, trapping 4 Soviet armies totaling approximately 660,000 men. A simultaneous encirclement at Bryansk captured an additional 100,000 Soviet soldiers. Within a single week, Operation Typhoon had matched Kiev's success, destroying 750,000 Soviet troops in 2 encirclement battles. But October was not August. The weather had changed. On October 7, the same day the Vyazma pocket closed, rain began falling across the central Russian plain. It rained continuously for 3 days. Then it rained intermittently for 2 weeks. Russian roads, most unpaved, many merely dirt tracks worn by peasant carts, dissolved into glutinous mud. The Russians called it Rasputitsa, the time without roads. German military vehicles designed for European highways floundered. Tanks advancing 30 kilometers per day in August now advanced 3 kilometers daily, when they could move at all. Trucks carrying supplies bogged down in mud so deep that entire convoys required hours to travel a single kilometer. Horses pulling artillery pieces collapsed from exhaustion. Infantry divisions marched through ankle-deep, sometimes knee-deep mud that sucked boots from feet and turned each kilometer into an ordeal. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Priller, serving with the 9th Panzer Division, wrote in his diary on October 15, "We have been trying to advance for 3 days. 3 days to move 12 kilometers. The mud is unbelievable. Tanks slip sideways off roads. Half-tracks cannot pull their loads. Yesterday, we spent 6 hours freeing a single truck. The Russians don't need to fight us. The mud is destroying us." The advance slowed but did not stop. German forces clawed forward through the mud kilometer by kilometer. By October 20, lead elements of 3rd Panzer Group reached positions 90 kilometers from Moscow. By October 27, advance units of 4th Panzer Group reached the Moscow-Volga Canal, just 65 kilometers from the Kremlin. But each kilometer cost time, fuel, and men. And then, in mid-November, the weather changed again. On November 13, temperatures plummeted. Within 48 hours, the mud froze solid. German vehicles stuck hub-deep in mud on November 12 found themselves trapped in frozen concrete on November 14. Crews used explosives to blast vehicles free from ice. But freed vehicles now faced a new enemy, cold beyond anything German forces had experienced. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius in late November, -30 degrees in December. German vehicles, designed for European conditions, failed catastrophically. Engine oil thickened into sludge. Grease in transmissions and differentials solidified. Radiator fluid froze, cracking engine blocks. Batteries died. Machine guns jammed as frozen condensation froze firing mechanisms solid. The soldiers fared no better. German winter uniforms, woolens and overcoats designed for German winters, provided inadequate protection against Russian cold. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties in some units. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets, newspapers, captured Soviet clothing, anything providing insulation. But the cold was merciless. By November 15, lead elements of German forces were within 30 kilometers of Moscow, close enough to see the spires of the Kremlin through field glasses on clear days. But close enough to see was not close enough to capture. Soviet reinforcements were arriving daily. Throughout October and November, Stalin pulled divisions from the Soviet Far East, troops released from guarding against possible Japanese attack after Soviet spy Richard Sorge confirmed Japan would strike south toward the Pacific rather than north toward Siberia. These Siberian divisions, equipped with winter clothing and trained for cold weather operations, counterattacked German positions beginning in mid-November. The advance ground to a halt. On November 15, 4th Panzer Group reached the Moscow suburb of Himki, just 20 kilometers from the Kremlin, the closest German forces would ever come. Recognition elements observed Moscow's streets through binoculars. They could advance no farther. Soviet forces fighting from prepared positions with winter equipment supplied by Moscow's factories and depots just miles away stopped every German attack. Hitler ordered the offensive to continue. Throughout late November, German forces launched repeated attacks toward Moscow from positions along a semicircular front north, west, and south of the city. Every attack failed. Soviet casualties were appalling. Estimates suggest 500,000 Soviet soldiers killed or wounded defending Moscow in October and November. But Soviet reserves kept arriving, fresh divisions replacing shattered ones, while German divisions had no replacements. Each German casualty reduced Germany's already overstretched forces further. On December 5, 1941, with temperatures at minus 35 degrees Celsius, Soviet forces under General Georgy Zhukov launched The question that haunted German commanders for the remainder of the war was simple. What if? What if Hitler had authorized the continued advance on Moscow in August? What if Panzer Group 2 had maintained momentum toward the Soviet capital instead of turning south toward Kiev? What if German forces had reached Moscow in September instead of November? The counterfactual cannot be proven, but the arithmetic is compelling. On August 21, when Hitler ordered Guderian south, German forward elements were approximately 220 kilometers from Moscow. Panzer groups in August, operating on dry roads with extended daylight hours and functioning vehicles, regularly advanced 30-40 kilometers daily during breakthrough operations. At that rate, German forces could have reached Moscow's outskirts in 1 week, allowing 2 additional weeks to encircle and capture the city. All accomplished by mid-September, 6 weeks before Rasputitsa and 10 weeks before winter cold. Moscow in September 1941 was not the fortress it became by November. Soviet defensive positions west of the city, the elaborate trench systems, bunkers, and anti-tank obstacles that stopped German forces in November, had been constructed during September and October by hundreds of thousands of Moscow civilians mobilized for emergency fortification work. Those fortifications did not exist in August. Moscow's garrison in August numbered approximately 200,000 troops, many recently mobilized and poorly trained. By November, Moscow's defense forces exceeded 800,000, including Siberian divisions and Guards Rifle divisions transferred from other fronts. Most critically, Soviet morale and political stability in September remained fragile. The German advance had shattered Soviet forces. Stalin had nearly suffered a nervous collapse in late June. Soviet citizens, remembering the chaos of the Russian Civil War and the brutal collectivization campaigns of the 1930s, harbored uncertain loyalty to Stalin's regime. Moscow's fall in September, with Stalin's government fleeing east, might have triggered political disintegration. But might have is not did. Hitler made his choice, and the consequences followed inexorably. The Battle of Kiev consumed 44 days, August 21 to October 2, plus an additional 2 weeks for refitting after the battle. During those 58 days, the strategic situation transformed completely. Soviet forces constructed Moscow's defensive belts. Soviet industry relocated production facilities beyond the Urals. Soviet commanders organized reserves and planned defensive operations. The weather changed from summer to autumn to winter, and German forces, instead of attacking a vulnerable enemy in ideal conditions, found themselves attacking a prepared enemy in the worst possible conditions. Field Marshal von Bock, removed from command in December 1941 after Operation Typhoon's failure, never forgave Hitler for the August decision. In his diary, von Bock wrote, "The decision to advance on Kiev instead of Moscow cost us the war. We were so close to victory. 1 month. That's all we needed. 1 month." Guderian was equally bitter. In his memoir, Panzer Leader, published in 1951, Guderian devoted an entire chapter to the August controversy. His assessment was withering. The drive to Kiev was operationally successful, but strategically catastrophic. We won the battle and lost the campaign. We destroyed 500,000 Soviet soldiers and gave the Soviet Union time to mobilize 5 million more. Hitler's economic obsessions blinded him to operational realities. By the time we turned back toward Moscow, we had lost the only asset that matters in warfare: time. General Halder's war diary entries from December 1941 and January 1942 document his assessment. The failure before Moscow stems directly from the diversion to Kiev, Halder wrote on December 20. Had we maintained pressure toward Moscow in August and September, the Soviet capital would have fallen before winter. Instead, we achieved a tactical victory at Kiev that consumed the time necessary for strategic victory. August 23, 1941. Wolfschanze, East Prussia. General Heinz Guderian flies back to his headquarters, having failed to change Hitler's mind. He knows with professional certainty that Germany has just lost the war. The Army Group Center Operations Officer, who meets Guderian at his headquarters, notices the general's expression. "How did it go?" the officer asks. "We are going to Kiev," Guderian replies. "Not Moscow, Kiev." "But sir, Moscow is—" "I know where Moscow is, Hauptmann," Guderian interrupts. "The Führer has made his decision. We will execute it as ordered. Alert the panzer divisions. Prepare route plans for southward movement." Later, alone in his office, Guderian writes in his personal diary, a practice he will maintain throughout the war. "Today I witnessed the moment when Germany lost the Eastern Front. Not in defeat, but in victory. Hitler has chosen Kiev over Moscow, resources over decision, economic theory over operational reality. We will win at Kiev. I am certain of that. My panzers will encircle and destroy Budyonny's armies. It will be a magnificent tactical achievement. And it will mean absolutely nothing, because while we are winning in Ukraine, the Soviets will be fortifying Moscow. When we finally turn back toward the capital, we will find defenses that do not exist today. We will face Soviet armies that have had time to mobilize. And we will be racing winter for an objective we could have taken in September if only we had maintained momentum." The prediction proved exactly accurate. The Battle of Kiev was Germany's greatest tactical victory. 665,000 Soviet prisoners. 4 armies annihilated. Operation Typhoon became Germany's greatest strategic failure. Moscow held. The Wehrmacht bled white. The Soviet counteroffensive shattering the myth of German invincibility. The irony is almost unbearable. Hitler achieved everything he wanted. German forces captured Kiev. They occupied Ukraine. They gained access to Ukrainian grain, coal, and industrial capacity. And none of it mattered, because by the time Germany secured Ukraine's resources, the Soviet Union had mobilized resources from beyond the Urals that dwarfed anything Ukraine provided. Germany won the battle for resources and lost the war for time. The examination of German strategic documents from August 1941, now preserved in archives in Germany, Russia, and the United States, reveals the precise moment when World War II's outcome became inevitable. The Army High Command's August 18 strategic paper was not wrong. Its analysis was mathematically correct. 45 days of good weather remained, enough for one decisive operation, not two. Its operational assessment was accurate. Moscow was vulnerable in August, increasingly fortified by September, nearly impregnable by November. Its strategic logic was sound. Destroying the Soviet command structure in Moscow mattered more than capturing Ukrainian territory. Hitler rejected sound strategy because he was fighting a different war than his generals. They were fighting the war that existed. He was fighting the war he believed should exist. A war where economic resources determined outcomes, where industrial capacity trumped operational momentum, where Germany's economic self-sufficiency mattered more than destroying enemy forces quickly. History rendered its verdict on December 5, 1941, when Soviet forces launched their counteroffensive and shattered the myth that Germany could defeat the Soviet Union. The war would continue for 3.5 more years. Germany would achieve tactical victories, but strategic victory, the decisive defeat of the Soviet Union that might have been achieved in September 1941, was gone forever, sacrificed in the Ukrainian wheat fields for resources Germany would never effectively exploit. The final irony came in January 1943, when Soviet forces encircled and destroyed Germany's 6th Army at Stalingrad. The encirclement employed the same operational technique Germany had perfected at Kiev: double envelopment by mobile forces, followed by systematic destruction of tracked formations. The student had learned from the master. The Battle of Kiev demonstrated that decisive